I guess it's time to start. So welcome to just one more thing with Spring and IntelliJ IDEA. I'm very happy to see so many faces. My name is Yann Cébron. I'll introduce myself a bit later. This is Stéphane.
Hello.
So why are we doing this talk and why are there two people, even from two different companies? I've been working on the Spring framework support in IntelliJ for the last 5 to 6 years. And during the last few years, Stéphane and I have been working very closely together, especially on Spring Boot, because that's what you do, right?
Yeah. So it's very interesting actually to work with a tool vendor, because you get a chance to push some guidelines and some best practices. And yeah, the relationship with the JetBrains team has been amazing, as I hope you'll see. But let's maybe start first with a question: who doesn't use IntelliJ? There is one. Okay, he's ashamed.
Don't be ashamed.
He changed his mind. Are you the guy using NetBeans, maybe? There's always one guy. No, it's not you.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So all die-hard IntelliJ fans, which of course pleases me. So what are we going to do in this talk today? The talk is basically split in two parts. The first part is about working with Spring in general in the IntelliJ IDE. And the second part will focus on Spring Boot, because that's what cool kids use. And the way we present this is that I will mainly talk about the IDE, while Stéphane will give you background information. And also we'll talk about how we collaborate and how we develop features together. So I hope it's interesting to learn both about the IDE as well as some background information about Spring and Spring Boot internals.
Let's do this.
So, no slides. We are going to stay in the IDE the whole time. If my computer switches, it does. So, the first part is Spring setup in the IDE. I'm repeating this in every talk I do about Spring, so please forgive me, but it's very, very important to do this and to do this correctly and to understand what implications this has if you don't do it. How can the IDE understand what your Spring application or application context does in your project? The way to tell IntelliJ about frameworks and their configuration is done via facets, which are basically like framework-specific settings, and they are attached to modules in IntelliJ. So each module can have their own set of facets, and in each facet you can then configure the framework-specific settings. And this is also how you do it for Spring. And one way to help you with this is when you open a project which has some Spring configuration files, you are going to see this notification down here in the right corner.
Yeah, if you see there's something you need to do.
Yeah. So we are trying to help you, to push you to do it. Nevertheless, I will explain it, or we are going to explain it here a bit in more detail. So the IDE found some Spring configuration files in this project, which is no surprise because it's our demo project, so there are hopefully some configuration files in there. And you are requested to set up a Spring facet. There is also an option, if there's no setup yet, and there are multiple files, to create a so-called default context. And what that does is to combine all Spring configuration files in one big application context, okay? Which is maybe right, but most probably not right if you have a more complex application. So basically what you need to tell the IDE is how does your application context look at runtime, right? So it can understand the configuration files which belong together. Maybe you have multiple application contexts which are separated. Maybe they have some parent-child relationships. This is all supported in the IDE, but you need to configure it because we cannot guess how it gets deployed and how it will behave at runtime. And of course, you want to have the same view in the IDE as you would have when the application is running on a server. There's one big exception from this, or actually two exceptions. And they are called Spring MVC web applications and the other one is Spring Boot applications. So
yeah,
why is that possible even?
The long story short is if you're using Spring Boot, there is an automatic way of doing all of this. So the reason why we're mentioning it is because it's very important to understand what's going on. But rest assured, if you're using Spring Boot, there's an auto detection mechanism. It is possible and it's easier. Yann just explained that if you use plain Spring Framework, then you may have like multiple configuration files. Maybe you're still using XML configuration. Maybe you have like a file from different projects because it's a legacy application or whatnot. With Spring Boot, it's really different because there's more convention. So we have more opinions. You have a source configuration, which is your Spring Boot application, the one where you put Spring Boot application on it. And from that, we infer a lot of things, and actually the IDE is replicating that behavior. So by looking in your source code, when they find that this application is using Spring Boot, they can locate the main Spring Boot class and infer the same default as the one that we apply. And we will see that in the remaining of the demo. But if you're using plain Spring Framework, or if you're using a project that doesn't use Spring Boot for some reason, don't do that. Then you'll need to do this. And it's important for you to do it, because otherwise you can't teach the IDE what your configuration looks like, and there's plenty of inspections that will not work.
Yes, so this is the main point. To some degree, some features might even work, Spring features in the IDE, even if you don't set up everything correctly, but you will definitely get wrong results when it comes to auto-wiring, resolving beans by names, by types and stuff like this. And everyone wants to have that cool navigation and inspections, of course, working correctly. So how can we help you setting up this context? I have one demo configuration class here, and we can see it's highlighted in yellow. So the IDE detected this is a Spring configuration class which is not yet set up, and we don't even have a Spring facet. Oh, actually we do have one, maybe. Let's have a look. So I press Alt-Enter to invoke the quick fixes.
Magic shortcut.
Yeah, you probably all know this shortcut. And it offers me as first option to create this Spring facet, which is required to set up the Spring application context or contexts. So when I do this, it will be added to the current module, and we see as expected warning message that no application contexts are configured yet because we didn't add anything or create any context. We can do this manually here by creating a new application context and selecting the relevant configuration files, but there's actually another option. So now the warning is still active, and the quick fix we get now, since we have a Spring facet now, is to actually configure an application context for this configuration.
So you're basically telling IntelliJ, if I'm starting this application, this is the source configuration file that I'm going to use.
Yeah. So the intention is to create a new application context. We will even choose a magically senseful name for you, the same as the configuration class. And now the yellow highlighting has gone. And if you paid close attention to the left side of the editor, you've seen a lot of icons coming in. And those are all Spring-related icons in this case. So we actually see the IDE now understands this is a Spring configuration class, and we get support. So anytime you have some Spring configuration class and no icons, that's a clear sign you are missing or have some error maybe in your setup. We are not going to look at all the navigation possibilities here in detail, just that you can navigate to anything. We resolve auto-wiring, we resolve usages of beans. But one thing I want to show today is how you can actually find setup errors in the IDE. How can we do this? We can actually create a dependency graph of the configurations. Okay, so this setup has a lot of imports and even an import of XML files. I can control-click here and go there. Another import in the import. And finally, we have a context component scan. So this is a bit tricky to understand if you join a new project and you have this kind of setup with imports and component scans and those having more imports and stuff like this. And you can visualize this in the IDE using the Spring Model Dependencies graph, which will look like this. So we can see all the nodes for the different configuration classes. Our main configuration starts here. We have all the imported configurations. And here we have the path to our XML files we just navigated. This is all nice, but can it also help us to prevent errors? Of course it can, because otherwise I wouldn't ask this question. So let me build an error. So what we do here is we put the same component scan twice in the same context, which is of course not a good idea. And if I regenerate this graph, oh, that is live demo effect, of course.
Caching.
Yeah, there's apparently some. No.
Or not.
Well, it doesn't work. I'm sorry, but that's the life of using IDE built from sources, more or less. So what it should do, and trust me, it does, is to show some red arrows here to indicate cycles. Okay. So if you have stuff like this, you can already see it in the IDE that there's maybe some problem. And maybe you can tell us what kind of problems are common in setups.
Yeah.
And
So that kind of stuff really helps you to better understand what the application context will do at runtime. And regarding those cycles, even though the IDE will tell you it's red, so actually what you would have seen is the component scan would have like some red arrow to a bean that already exists, because the first pass of the component scan will have detected it. And in practice, if you run that app, it will work, because the context will resolve those cycles for you to a certain extent. Probably it's a feature that we may have like not to implement, because every time there's an issue we can actually detect, we try our best to fix the application context. So the application will run, but it will not run as effectively as it should have been. So being aware of those cycles actually helps you to avoid unnecessary scanning. So that's one of the examples that that graph can help you with. The other one is to better understand which pieces of your application, if you have a multi-configuration, multi-modules configuration application, is to better understand which piece actually trigger what part of the application.
Exactly. So let's conclude the topic setup for now. I think we covered all the most important points. So remember to set up your Spring Facet and your application context. You have nothing to do if you have Spring MVC and Spring Boot. Everything will be auto-detected. So the next general topic I would like to cover very quickly is navigation in Spring applications. So we already have some navigation possibilities here, but what if I don't know where one bean is located at all? So we have a bean named custom name here, and let's pretend we have a huge application, but I don't know where this bean is defined at all. How can you locate beans? And one way is to use go to symbol feature in the IDE. And we can just magically type the bean name there. And we even see a small bean icon here, and I can go there directly. This also works for request mappings. So I'm just enabling the other demo application here, which is a Spring MVC application.
So again, if you're using Spring Boot, you don't have to do that.
Yeah.
Just showing you the insight so that you understand what that does.
So actually, now you can see this small auto-detected behind the application context here, which tells you that the IDE has figured out this application context for you automatically, which works for Spring MVC, as we can see here. And we have one controller here. And we can see we have two request mappings here, myPath and myPath2. Sorry for the bad names, but I'm really not very motivated to find useful names. But again, we can use go-to symbol and just type 1// and you will get the list of all the request mappings in this application, right? Just hit enter and you get exactly to the same request mapping. So that's a very nice way if you have like some bug report containing some URL or something. You can find the controller easily by using the URL. One more thing I want to cover is how to understand this whole setup of application context, configuration files, and beans. So if I want to find out, for example, if this bean here, which is in this main configuration class, in the application context called main configuration, but let's pretend I don't know this. How can I locate this bean within the Spring facet setup? I can use one generic feature which is called select int, and I can open it in the Spring Beans tool window. And if I turn on all of this before, it will be more impressive. So you can see now we are in the module Spring Tricks, in the configuration main configuration, in the context main configuration, sorry, in the configuration class main configuration, and our bean is already selected here for us. So that's a nice way to understand, okay, where is this bean actually defined? How does it get into my context? Okay?
Zoom in. Can you zoom in?
No.
Nope.
Yeah. This Spring tool window also has some nice abilities to visualize like dependencies between beans. You can switch on implicit and infrastructure beans and all kind of stuff. You can search by name. So it's also a nice way to navigate your Spring context, but it's very easy to figure out yourself. Okay. Next topic we want to cover is Kotlin. Who knows about Kotlin? Or maybe has even tried Kotlin? Okay, that's about
20%?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Kotlin is a JVM programming language that JetBrains has been developing, and it's gotten more and more popular, first in the Android space, but now more and more increasingly also on the server side, and especially in the Spring framework universe. So first, some notes about the support in the IDE. We are currently working very hard to bring all the features you know from Java. So we have a lot of inspections for Spring and the frameworks, which work very nicely, but only with Java code yet. We are transferring them to make them work with Kotlin code in exactly the same way, okay? So you will get more and more the same level of support for Kotlin code as well. There's already quite some stuff in the latest version, but there's still some stuff to do. So one thing I want to quickly demonstrate is, for example, this simple Kotlin class, and we have some caching annotation from Spring framework, and you can see this condition is highlighted in a funny way, which indicates that there's a Spring expression language expression inside the string, and I can demonstrate that we have all the code inside here as well. So the IDE is quite smart about knowing about this caching context. It will even propose you all the relevant beans and objects which are available at runtime at this specific point when it's called.
So those also work with Java. So those features were introduced with Java, and now it's being ported to the Kotlin language as well.
So maybe you can give us some information about what Spring Framework is doing about Kotlin.
Right. So in Spring Framework 5 now there is official support for Kotlin as a first class language. We use massively extensions, so it's a way in the Kotlin language to make the compiler more smart about your API. So if you have, for instance, if you have an API where you need to pass the type of the return collection because of type inference, then you can teach Kotlin where that information is, and you don't have to provide it. So there is a way to change an API to make it more smart with Kotlin. We also have all kinds of DSLs, so WebFlexFN and the bin registration API, for instance, they have a custom Kotlin DSL so that it's more easy for you to define those if you choose to use Kotlin. We also have the nullability support in Spring Framework. So Kotlin has a great story regarding null safety and making sure you don't end up with null pointer exception. But if you use a Java API that's not ready for that, it can be weird because if there is no nullable information, every type you use, becomes nullable, and even though it's not the case, so that's kind of annoying. So we've also done that. There's also a few extensions in Spring Boot and Spring Data, so there's actually quite a compelling story there.
Yeah. So that concludes our general part, and now comes the cool part. So we are going to switch to Spring Boot. And as everyone knows, building Spring Boot applications should be done with Spring Initializer. So what is Spring Initializer?
So who doesn't know that thing? 2, yeah, good, 3. So Spring Initializer, it's a service that allows you to get started with Spring Boot. You basically provide a few basic information about the project you want to start. You shop for dependencies, like you shop on Amazon or whatnot. So you select the dependency you want to use, and then that's going to generate an empty project for you. So with a build file and a basic Spring Boot application, a test, and you'll be able to get started basically. Spring Initializer, as its core, is a multi-client infrastructure. So you have one client here, which is the web UI, but you can also use it on the command line. So you can use, for instance, try curl start of spring.io, and you'll see what happens. Or you can use also HTTP if you prefer that. And there's also an integration with all IDEs. So I know we're not supposed to talk about competitors during this talk, but there is support in IntelliJ IDEA. We'll show you that. There is also support in Eclipse and support in NetBeans. There are other clients, command line clients, that have been built over the years. But what we want to show you now is this unique experience where you can get started with one tool. You stay in the IDE, and you can use that service without leaving the IDE, basically.
Yeah. So basically, we can create a new project or new module using Spring Initializer. And the first option you have is also to use a custom initializer. So maybe you can tell us what would it be?
So companies actually have their own version of the initializer. They have different dependencies or different defaults, or sometimes they also fork the code to change the way the build system is generated, because they need to have extra plugins, or they want to change the way the project works. Some companies also added multi-module support, which is something we are considering. But in any case, you can have your own initializer in your own company, and use that instead of the main one, and you'll still get all the support. So you'll still be able to use it directly from the IDE.
Okay, so let's just use the default start.spring.io. We have a couple of project metadata stuff we can fill in, but the interesting part is, of course, selecting the starters we want to have in our application. They are basically grouped here on the first column, and each group has a number of possible starters you can select, but you can also use search here. So for example, if I type something like cloud, there will be plenty of results, and you can easily shop for dependencies like this. And the nice thing is, if you select a Spring Boot version which is not compatible with some of the Spring's starters, the incompatible will be sorted to the end of the list automatically, so they don't get in your way. Also, we have the ability to show you some links here to some documentation, references, guides, even maybe sample applications in there. So this is something the Pivotal team is building for you.
Actually, it's a funny story, because we built this in the metadata so that clients can use it, and we haven't had the time to update our own client to use it. So if you haven't seen that on start.spring.io, it's because it's not implemented. And the story, actually, Yann implemented that in the IDE before it went to production. So yeah. We're going to do it. We need a bit more time, but we have some ideas to also use those links on start.spring.io.
Okay, so I can now select a couple of dependencies here, and all the selected dependencies will be listed here. I will click next. It will create or download the project from the server, and we will be ready to start. For now, we are going to use a pre-existing Spring Boot application I created because it also has some real code in there. Back to the topic of setup. Spring Boot application means you don't need to do anything. As soon as Spring Framework is detected and Spring Boot Framework is detected, the Spring Facet will be there automatically. And as we can see, there's an auto-detected Spring Boot application. And in this case, we even have a Spring Boot MVC application. So there will also be the corresponding context here auto-detected for you. No manual setup required. And actually, it will not work if you try to set it up manually for Spring Boot. So there's one important thing in Spring Boot, and it's called configuration files. This here is full of errors because I want them to be there, but usually you won't have them. We'll talk about this a bit later. So the usual way to configure stuff is in an application.properties or application.yaml, but you can also use a custom name for those configuration files. I quickly show you in the IDE how it's done, and Stéphane can then tell us why you would actually want to do this.
Right. So it's the same topic really as teaching the IDE what your configuration is. It goes up to that stuff because putting configuration keys there has an impact on the auto configuration. It has an impact on features that Spring Boot is going to enable for you. And again, the IDE needs to know about it to give you proper inspection. So if you don't like application as a name, or if you prefer those files to be searched from a different place because your company policy is different, or maybe you have some kind of guideline within your company that configuration files are named in a certain way, then Spring Boot will perfectly allow that. So there's a few things you need to configure, and you'll be able to change either the name or the location. But what's important is that you also need to be able to tell the IDE where those files are now. And that's pretty much what Yann is going to show us, or maybe you did already.
No, I will do now. So we have the default application.properties here, and we have some more properties files which I will turn into Spring Boot configuration files right now. So when you open Spring Facet and you have a Spring Boot application context selected, you will get this additional icon down here in the toolbar, which allows you to customize your Spring Boot setup. And one thing we can do here is to set the configuration properties spring.config.name, which will tell the IDE the base name for your configuration files. And we even have code completion here. So I set now the default name for configuration files to a different one than application, and it detected 2 files. So what is the difference between those two?
Yeah, so, oh wow. So you can see that it's replicating what Spring Boot does if you don't know about that feature, profile management. So if you enable a profile with Spring Boot and you have a file that ends with the same name, dash and the name of that profile, we will load that automatically. So it's a way for you to segment configuration according to a target environment, for instance. Again, what the IDE does here is replicating that logic and detecting those files. As we will see, if you enable a profile, for instance, the IDE will also know about it, and it will load the right keys, and it will infer the right model for you.
Right, so I changed the setting now, and as you can see here in the tree already, the icons changed. So application.properties is no longer a Spring Boot configuration file in the IDE, but our custom named configuration files are now working. And I can verify this by invoking code completion here, which will show the list of all the configuration keys we have in this application.
So that's really important because the IDE now is telling you how it's configured. Application properties, even though it's a standard name, you can see now it's considered as a simple property file Spring Boot doesn't know about, because this is exactly what it is about. It's not going to load it. It's not going to look at the content. So that way, you basically replicate what Spring Boot will do at runtime right from the IDE.
All right, so I'll revert this change now for the next demo we'll do later. So now everything will go back to the state we had before. What the IDE will also do is detect the so-called Bootstrap context. For this, I have to switch to a different project, which has some Spring Boot Cloud support. And if we take a quick look at the Spring Facet here, we can see there's quite a lot of new stuff we haven't seen yet. And one of them is the Bootstrap application context. So what is the difference between this and the main class?
So this is a Spring Cloud application. Spring Cloud, when it uses the config server, or when it needs to bootstrap, that's the term, to an environment. So it's in you have a distributed system, and they need to fetch the configuration. For instance, there are things that needs to be done that requires more power than just having a simple class like you would have with Spring Boot, the environment post-processor, for instance. So what Spring Cloud does, it creates a Bootstrap context for which the main purpose is to prepare the environment. So it's retrieving the config, and making sure that the actual context can be configured properly. This is how it works in Spring Cloud. And again, the IDE now replicates that behavior and detects those elements, which means that bootstrap.properties will also be detected. You'll be able to autocomplete configuration keys in there, etc., etc.
Yeah. So that's also what we can see here. The Bootstrap context has the Bootstrap properties configuration file, while the application context of the main application has application.properties. And most important point, Bootstrap has this nice cloud logo over it, so you can easily distinguish the configuration files as well. If we actually run a Bootstrap application, Bootstrap-enabled application, we will also see this in the endpoints. We'll go and talk about the endpoints a bit later, but you can see there are two contexts here created. So that's also a sign of a Bootstrap-enabled application. So let's go back to our previous plain Spring Boot application. And I just want to summarize very quickly what we did in terms of auto-configuration support in the IDE. So the IDE basically replicates what Spring will do at runtime. So we basically perform the same steps that Spring Boot does on context initializing. So we look at all the auto-configuration classes. There are lots of conditions on those auto-configuration classes. There are imports to more configurations, and those have even more conditions and more custom setups. And we basically replicate all of this evaluation that Spring Boot does at runtime in the IDE in real time. Okay, so when you navigate the sources, you will basically get exactly the same state as you would get at runtime. It is not 100% possible yet. We are still working on this because Spring Boot comes with a lot of custom implementations of runtime conditions, whether to enable or disable specific configurations or beans. We are trying to replicate this one by one. We've put a lot of work in this. We've also improved performance a lot in the recent releases. And actually there was some funny collaboration happening accidentally, more or less.
Yeah, well, actually you remind me one I forgot this morning. So one thing that Yann did and the team when they were working on this model is to rebuild the model based on the auto configuration and the nested configuration classes, and they hit a performance problem while computing that. And what their tests show is that they realize that if we change the way certain conditions are evaluated, not the order of the condition, but for instance, conditional on class, if we swap, if conditional on class has two parameters, we check for that class and that class. If we swap that, it was a bit faster. So we started investigating on our end how to do this, and we have plans to actually improve this. And at the same time, they had a performance problem locating those conditions, and we actually have a dedicated format for that we use. So we generate a metadata file at compilation time so that we don't have to evaluate that over and over again, and they actually read that in the IDE to speed this up.
Yeah.
So it's really going both ways.
Yeah. So I think that's a nice example how close collaboration between the Spring Boot guys and the IDE team for Spring works, and yeah, we both profit directly from working together. Um, Spring Boot 2 is the latest release, and there have been quite some changes there. Maybe you could just summarize one or two important points.
Oh wow, that's why that thing is in red, basically.
Yeah.
So plenty of changes in the actuator, a better structure configuration model. So that's why we had to rename a few things. Better Spring security. Okay, I'm not going to talk about any of that. But what's important here is we wanted to do two things related to that file you have here. One is we wanted to reduce the number of root namespace that we use. So what I mean by root namespace is the left part of the key. So as you can see, for instance, banner.location, banner is a root namespace, which means that no one else can take that name. Of course, no one else does because banner is Spring Boot. Well, okay, anyway. So what we've done in 2.0 is rename that to spring.banner.location, so that banner root namespace is available. So maybe, Yann, you can quickly show what the IDE can do with this now. So typically what that means, if you upgrade to 2.0 and you have a banner location and you've configured that way, we will not read this. You'll have to rename the key first.
Yeah, and the information about this deprecation of this configuration key is embedded in the configuration data that is packaged in the Spring Boot jars. And the IDE reads this information and can offer us to remove the deprecated key and use the replacement key, which is specified in the metadata. So hitting enter, new configuration key is used, everything is green again, except for the next one, which is also shown as deprecated. So this is a bit more tricky because the replacement key has actually a changed type. So Spring main show banner is a Boolean property, but the replacement key is actually now an enum. But the IDE is smart enough to figure this out and help you. So if I choose the fix now, it will actually show me, it will actually remove the existing value because it doesn't make sense here, and show you the completion automatically because you need to choose now one of the enum keys which belong to this new key. So I choose off, for example.
Don't do that.
Yeah, I don't do that because Josh hates me for this, but this is the way the IDE can also help you to migrate to Spring 2 configuration keys. And another example is here we have the actuator config key, which has changed from going from a string to a map now. And another thing is here that the map key has changed, but of course we want to keep our own map key inside that configuration key, and it will just do that for you. And there's another thing built into Spring Boot, right, to help you?
Yeah, so if you upgrade to 2.0, there is a library that you can add just for the sake of the migration that will do the same thing and rename properties. Rename the properties they can automatically so that the application can use them directly, and output a report at the end telling you what you have to do. So of course, if you're using an IDE and you open that file, you'll immediately see those issues. But the purpose of that migrator is that maybe you'll have configuration in different places. For instance, maybe you have a system property, or maybe you have an environment variable somewhere in your application. And if you start the app with that jar, it will tell you in that place, you still have a key that doesn't work. I've renamed it for you, or you have now to migrate to the new system. So it's really a great way to get a report of the things that you still have to migrate. And once you're done, you need to remove that dependency because the only purpose is to help you during migration.
Okay, just quickly striking through Spring MVC support in Spring Boot. It finally works. We added this last year, and all the features you know from the plain Spring MVC support work in Spring Boot as well. So we can navigate to views. Inside the view, we can navigate to attributes which are defined in the controller. So that's exactly the same experience you had from plain Spring MVC applications. And one thing we added in recent versions is a new integration with our HTTP built-in REST client in the IDE. And if you enable actuator dependency in your Spring Boot application, you will get this nice green triangle now at your request mappings. And it offers me 3 options. One of them is to open this request mapping in the browser. Fair enough. Run the HTTP request inside the IDE, which I'm going to do now. And we can see that something was returned.
Can you increase the font maybe?
Not very easily, unfortunately.
Come on.
I don't know how. Trust me, there's HTML though.
So that's the error page for those in the back. That's the
Yep.
error page, the standard error page that says bat request, because the request parameter named name, I think,
Yep.
was not provided. So we actually need to change the request to fix that.
Yeah, and I can now use the built-in HTTP request editor and language in the IDE. So I can specify a HTTP call up there. And
Name.
it's called name. Yeah, I always forget. And now I can run this request again. And now I have a proper result.
So for those in the back, it's not JSON and it's not an error anymore. It's an HTML, the HTML rendering.
Yeah. So that's a nice way to debug your request, your controllers, especially if you have some REST requests and you need to do a quick check if some things work correctly or not. Run configuration. We added quite a lot of new options. I'm just going to tell about them very quickly because we are running out of time as usually. You can now update static resources and classes using Spring Boot Dev Tools in your application in the IDE. So that's very helpful if you are changing templates and or controller code in your application to debug. There's plenty of options here. All the standard ways of DevTools are supported right in the IDE. I think that's the big change in this area. And one thing which is very helpful if you still use Tomcat, we finally fixed the problem with provided scope dependencies. So Tomcat will also now start up correctly using the run configuration in the IDE.
So one of the most confusing part about DevTools that if you start using it, it can be confusing to understand. Is what we do is we monitor the class path, so we don't monitor your source files. So if you modify, for instance, a template, if you don't do anything, it's still in your source file. It's not on the class path, so we can't see that you've changed a template, right? So you still have to do build project, even though you only change a template. It's more obvious when you change code, because if you change code, you obviously need to recompile, but for a template, it's less obvious. So that support is actually very great, because you can fine-tune the behavior. So for instance, you could say, if the focus change, if I go outside of the IntelliJ IDEA window, then refresh. So build a project for me, update the class path for me. Which means that if you work on something and then you switch to the browser, the operation of switching to the browser will automatically trigger DevTools.
Yeah. So the last topic we are going to cover in this talk now is the actuator endpoints. There's actually a talk right now about it, which I highly suggest to watch later on recording. So actuators are basically a way to inspect your running application. It can expose any kind of information about its own state. One thing which is nice is that we can actually inspect the application context here.
So this is the actual runtime application this time,
yes.
right? Everything we've been showing you so far is the IDE inferring what the application will be. This is the exact content of the running application now.
Yeah. And one thing we added in the latest development version is you can switch from this view, hierarchy view, to a graph view. So you will see, if you have enough screen space.
Even me can't see that.
You will see the graph of all the beans, similar to the dependencies graph we had before, but now with beans, and this data is also taken from the running application, okay? Of course, you can go to the specified bean directly from this graph. So that's a very nice way to visualize what your application is doing at runtime. Health tab exposes all sort of runtime information. So built-in is like This space, there's a lot of health endpoints built into various parts of Spring Boot starters, which will expose relevant information.
And if you have your custom Earth indicator, it will end up here as well,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's true. And the last tab is mappings, which allows us to browse all the request mappings. We can also invoke them directly from this list and also invoke the HTTP request editor we just showed by navigating directly from the controller. Here we have a nice list of all the controller URLs, and we can directly navigate to the request mapping editor. Very last thing, we finally have a run dashboard. So I will just quickly show this here. This application has 2 Spring Boot applications here, and we have the list of applications here on the left. We can switch between those applications here, and the nice thing is that you can select a number of applications and stop and start them at the same time, which I think is the main point when you develop with microservices. You need all of them running, and that's very easy doable with the run dashboard now.
Can we go back to the banner of this one?
The banner?
Yes. I have something to complain about.
Yeah, it's a very old version.
Why do you use 1.2.8 exactly?
Because that's a demo application I found on the internet.
We'll have a chat later.
Yeah, it's a bit outdated. I agree. So last bit, just to tease you, is we are working on Reactor framework support in IntelliJ now. It's not strictly Spring specific, but it's a very important topic for the Spring ecosystem, especially in Spring Boot and all the other frameworks. Webflux is now the new thing. And as you can see, in this very limited Reactor code, we have now some inspections which highlight like usual things you do wrong when you start new with Reactor, which is a bit hard to grasp maybe at the first steps. And we are working now together again with the Pivotal guys, working on this whole Reactor stuff and trying to help you with new inspections. So this is something that is being worked on right now.
So yeah, that's a good summary of what basically we are doing together, is basically pushing best practices and pushing common mistakes. Stuff that the community, the common pitfalls that the community hits when they start working on something new, or maybe something that's not new. And then we have a chance to actually communicate that with them and those built-in instructions. So for instance, this one, the first, don't implement publisher yourself because it will not work. Don't do that. That's why you have a choice of reactive streams implementation. And there's a few more things there. Like for instance, you have a Flux, but you're not assigning it, so it won't do anything. That kind of stuff. I think it's quite useful.
And the best thing is those inspections work on Kotlin already out of the box, so you are basically ready to use the latest and coolest, both language and framework-wise. And I think that's a nice conclusion of our talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.